It's kind of wild how even the most brilliant people in history could get some pretty basic stuff so wrong. Today we're diving into something, well, a topic some folks might find uncomfortable, the philosophical justifications, if you can even call them that, used for slavery.
Yeah, it's tough to look back on these ideas for sure, but
Heck
we
yeah.
got it right. I mean, to understand how the world got to where it is, we got to grapple with this stuff. So we'll be looking at the philosophies of some, well, pretty influential figures. Aristotle, for one, and then how those ideas, thank goodness, were challenged, ultimately overturned.
So we've got a whole stack of philosophical texts, historical accounts, the whole works. And the big question, the one we're really trying to wrap our heads around is, how did people even try to rationalize something as horrific as slavery? Like, what were the arguments?
Well, one place we got to start, I think, is ancient Greece. We pictured the Greeks and it's all like democracy, birthplace of philosophy, all that. But can't forget, slavery was a huge part of their society. And Aristotle, smart as he was, had some seriously problematic views. He actually developed this whole concept called natural slavery.
Natural slavery. Wait, is he saying some people are, like, just born to be slaves? That's messed up.
Pretty much, yeah. Aristotle, he believed some people just lack the capacity for reason and self-governance, so they're like naturally suited for servitude. He even argued that it was like beneficial for them to be ruled by, well, people with more intellect and morals.
It's chilling.
Yeah.
So basically, the ability to reason, that's what separates the master from the slave, in his view.
Yeah, and this is where it gets really interesting, I think. Aristotle's whole philosophy, it's centered on this idea that reason is what makes us human. It's what separates us from animals, right? So by saying some people just don't have that capacity, well, he's dehumanizing them, saying they're less than human, essentially.
And in practice, how did this whole natural slavery thing play out? Did Aristotle have any, I don't know, guidelines for how slaves should be treated?
Well, yeah, he did. Even though he believed they were inherently inferior, he thought masters had a moral obligation to treat them, well, justly. He saw it as a kind of division of labor. Some folks are just naturally suited for, like, manual work, which then frees up citizens to pursue, higher stuff, philosophy, politics, all that.
Okay, but hang on. Doesn't that still raise, like, a huge ethical question? Can any system that denies someone their freedom actually be just,
Yeah.
regardless of how you treat them?
Yeah, that's a question that, well, philosophers have been wrestling with for centuries. And gotta remember that even in Aristotle's own time, there were folks who pushed back against these ideas. Not everyone just went along with it.
Right, right. Okay, so we've got Aristotle laying down this groundwork, this natural slave concept. Did other thinkers, down the line pick up on this? How did it evolve?
Oh, absolutely. Aristotle's writing had a massive impact on Western thought, and that included his ideas about slavery. Later thinkers, they absorbed these ideas, adapted them, sometimes in really surprising ways.
Okay, like how? Give me an example.
Okay, well, let's jump ahead a bit to the rise of Christianity. Now, you'd think a religion based on, love, compassion, all that would be totally against slavery, right? But things are rarely that simple.
Yeah, because I remember something about wasn't it the curse of Ham
Mm-hmm.
from the Bible? Wasn't that used to justify slavery?
Exactly. That's like the prime example of how religious texts get interpreted to fit existing power structures. You had Christian theologians using that passage from Genesis, saying certain groups were like divinely ordained to be enslaved.
Wow. So even though the Bible doesn't, like, outright endorse slavery,
Yeah.
they found ways to twist it.
Sadly, yeah. And it wasn't just Christianity either. Certain interpretations of the Quran, those were used to justify slavery in some Islamic societies too. Though Islamic law did have strict rules around it, gotta say that, emphasizing, fair treatment, the chance for eventual freedom.
It's like they were cherry-picking scriptures, right,
Huh.
to fit their own biases. Makes you wonder, can any belief system really escape the influence of, I don't know, the dominant culture around it?
It's a good question. It does seem that even the most well-intentioned beliefs, they can get distorted to serve less than noble purposes, that's for sure.
Okay, so we've got ancient Greek ideas, then religious justifications piled on top. What happens as we move into, like, the Enlightenment? You'd think with all the focus on reason, individual rights, things that have shifted, right?
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But the Enlightenment, for all its progress, well, it also gave birth to some really dangerous ideas.
Dangerous how? What do you mean?
This is when we see scientific racism start to take hold. Thinkers in the 18th and 19th centuries, they start using like the language of science to justify racial hierarchies. They claim to have proof that some races were just inherently inferior.
So instead of holy books or old philosophies, now it's science backing up their prejudice. That's just
Yeah,
sneaky.
flawed studies, misrepresented data, all these fancy theories designed to prove some races were meant to rule and others to serve. It's really messed up.
And I'm guessing this so-called science that played a big role in justifying colonialism, the whole transatlantic slave trade.
Oh, absolutely. It gave a kind of like intellectual veneer to some truly awful practices. And remember, these were considered brilliant minds at the time. Thomas Jefferson, for example, he wrote about liberty and all that, but also believed black people were inherently inferior.
Hold up. Thomas Jefferson, the all men are created equal guy.
Yep, the same one. It's a stark reminder, isn't it? Even the most enlightened people can be blinded by the prejudices of their time. Those ideas about racial hierarchy, they became so deeply entrenched, and honestly, we're still dealing with the consequences today.
So we've gone from ancient Greece to religion to scientific racism. It's a pretty bleak picture, gotta say. Did anyone see through this crap back then? Was there any pushback at all?
Of course, there were always people who recognized how unjust it was, and they fought hard to like expose the bad logic behind these justifications. Problem was, their voices often got drowned out.
Okay, so that's where the abolitionist movement comes in, right?
You got it. But before we jump into that, there's one more justification we got to talk about, the economic argument for slavery.
Ah, yes, the classic slavery is good for the economy line. Must have been popular with the folks profiting off the system, I bet.
You're not wrong. Thinkers like James Mill, big economist, he argued that forced labor was like essential for national wealth, more efficient than free labor, said getting rid of it would wreck the economy.
It's amazing how they could just, like, ignore the human suffering. It's like they saw enslaved people as, I don't know, cogs in a machine or something.
Yeah.
Just, like, expendable for profit.
And that's a really important point. Those economic arguments, they completely dehumanized enslaved people. They were just like units of production,
Yeah.
no dignity, no worth as human beings. It's a reminder that when you put profit over people, you always end up on the wrong side of history.
Well said. Those defending slavery, they went to great lengths to justify something fundamentally immoral. They twisted philosophy, religion, even science to fit their agenda. But like you said, there were those who saw through it, who fought back.
Right. And that's where the story of the abolitionist movement starts. It's a story of courage, resilience, the human spirit fighting for justice. But, well, we'll save that for part 2 of our deep dive.
Back again. Last time, well, things got a little intense, unpacking all the ways people throughout history try to justify, well, the unjustifiable, slavery. But like we said, there were always folks who weren't buying it.
Right on. And that's where the story of the abolitionist movement really gets going. It's like this fascinating look at how people can challenge these like deeply ingrained ideas and fight for a more just world.
Yeah, I'm ready to hear about some hope after last time. So paint us a picture. What were the early days of this movement like?
Well, I don't remember. It wasn't like one big thing, the abolitionist movement. It had roots in all sorts of places, intellectual circles, religious groups, social movements, and it evolved over time.
Okay, so multiple threads kind of coming together. What were some of the big drivers early on?
One surprising one is, well, the Enlightenment itself. Kind of ironic, huh? Given that some Enlightenment thinkers were the ones pushing that scientific racism stuff we talked about.
Yeah, that is kind of hard to wrap your head around. How the same movement lead to both?
Well, see, the Enlightenment, it was all about reason, individual rights, all that. And kind of accidentally, that laid the groundwork for challenging the whole idea of owning another person.
Ah, I see. So like those ideas of natural rights, equality, they started to plant seeds of doubt about slavery.
Exactly. It created space for like critical thinking, questioning those old hierarchies that people just took for granted. And then you also had religious groups like the Quakers. They were at the forefront of abolition big time. Saw slavery as a sin, against God's will.
So Enlightenment ideals on one hand, religious conviction on the other. Anything else that helped this movement gain some steam?
Well, this might seem obvious, but the accounts from enslaved people themselves, those were huge. People like Olaudah Equiano, we mentioned him before, right? He wrote these powerful narratives, exposed the brutality of the slave trade.
I bet those stories were just like gut-wrenching, but also incredibly powerful to hear it straight from the people who lived through it.
Absolutely. It humanized the issue, in a way that those abstract philosophical debates just couldn't. It wasn't about inferior beings anymore. It was about, like, individuals, families, hopes, dreams, just like anyone else.
Yeah, it's like those personal stories cut through all the BS,
Yeah.
force people to see the real human cost.
Right on. They appealed to people's empathy, and that's a powerful thing. Ignited a sense of moral outrage, and that was essential to, like, mobilizing a movement.
So who are some of the key figures leading this charge? The big names in the abolition movement.
Well, in Britain, you got William Wilberforce. He was a member of parliament, spent his whole life trying to end the transatlantic slave trade, known for his, like, persuasive speeches, tireless campaigning.
Sounds like he really used his platform to push for change. What were some of the arguments he made?
Oh, he was a master at, like, moral argumentation. Didn't just appeal to people's heads, but to their hearts. He'd say that slavery was a stain on Britain's national character, a betrayal of its values. Liberty, justice, all that.
Powerful stuff. And what about in the U.S.? Had to be even more complicated there, right? Given, well, how much the nation relied on slave labor.
Absolutely. The fight for abolition in the U.S., that was a long, tough battle. But some incredible figures emerged. People like Frederick Douglass. We talked about him before.
Right, he escaped slavery himself. That must resonated with people hearing his story.
Oh, it did. He had this way of articulating the hypocrisy of a nation that claimed to be like this beacon of freedom while still upholding slavery. It was brilliant.
His own experiences gave his words so much weight, living proof of the system's cruelty.
Exactly. And he didn't shy away from calling out those contradictions. He traveled all over giving speeches, moved audiences with his eloquence, his passion, challenged those racist stereotypes head on, made a powerful case for the humanity of Black people.
That takes guts, standing up against such a powerful system. He was incredibly brave.
Oh, he was. And countless others joined the movement, risked their lives, their livelihoods, to fight for what they believed in. People like Harriet Tubman, she helped hundreds escape through the Underground Railroad. And Sojourner Truth, she advocated for abolition and women's rights. Powerful woman. And William Lloyd Garrison, he was a white abolitionist, published this influential anti-slavery newspaper, The Liberator.
So it was a pretty diverse movement. People from all walks of life, Black and white, men and women, all united against slavery.
That diversity, that was one of its biggest strengths. Showed that this wasn't just one group's fight, it was about these fundamental principles: equality, justice for all.
Yeah, it's amazing how a cause can transcend those social and racial divides like that.
A testament to human empathy, for sure. That desire for a better world.
We've talked Wilberforce in Britain, Douglass in the U.S. Any notable figures in other parts of the world doing this work?
Oh, totally. Abolition was global. For example, in Latin America, there was Simón Bolívar, key figure in those independence movements against Spain. He was a big advocate for abolishing slavery, too.
So the fight against slavery was tied to these broader struggles: independence, self-determination.
Makes sense, right? People were realizing, hey, freedom from colonial rule and freedom from slavery, those are kind of connected.
It's fascinating to see all these threads of resistance kind of weaving together across the world.
Yeah, and it reminds us that movements for social change, they don't happen in a vacuum. They build on each other, inspire each other. It's like a ripple effect, it can lead to some really big changes.
So we got this powerful, diverse movement gaining momentum. What were some of their go-to arguments, the ones they used to counter all those pro-slavery justifications we talked about last time?
They used all sorts of approaches: reason, morality, religion, even economics. They were like masters at taking apart those pro-slavery arguments piece by piece.
Had to be pretty strategic about it, I imagine. What were some of their most effective tactics?
One that was really powerful was just highlighting the achievements of Black people throughout history, pointing to Black artists, writers, scientists, inventors, proving that whole Black inferiority thing was total nonsense.
So they fought those stereotypes with concrete examples of Black excellence.
Exactly. Evidence and logic to dismantle prejudice. They challenged the whole idea of, natural slaves, argued that all human beings, no matter their race, are born with dignity, with worth.
That reminds me of those Enlightenment ideas, right? About natural rights. Did the abolitionists use that?
Oh, yeah, they did. They'd use the language of natural rights to argue that slavery was a violation of human freedom, human autonomy. And they'd use religious principles, too, emphasizing those biblical teachings about love, compassion, the equality of all God's children.
It's interesting how they could, reclaim some of those religious arguments. The ones that had been used to justify slavery, they used them to advocate for its end.
It shows the power of, reinterpreting those texts, challenging those dominant narratives that have been used to oppress people. And they didn't stop there. They even tackled those economic arguments head on.
Okay, I'm curious about that. How'd they argue against the whole slavery is good for the economy thing?
They pointed out that forced labor is actually inefficient, brutal. Argued that a system based on free labor, where people are motivated by choice, by opportunity, would be more productive in the long run. Better for everyone.
So they were saying slavery wasn't just morally wrong, but also economically dumb.
Exactly. They understood that appealing to people's self-interest could be very persuasive. And got to remember, a lot of abolitionists were also involved in other movements. Workers' rights, women's suffrage.
So they saw all these different struggles for justice as connected.
Absolutely. They recognized that systems of oppression, they often reinforce each other, and that real liberation requires like a holistic approach. You got to tackle it all.
It's clear that the abolitionist movement, it was more than just about ending slavery. It laid the groundwork for so many social justice movements today.
You got it. They were pioneers, developed tactics and strategies that would be used by, well, the civil rights movement, women's rights, LGBTQ plus rights, so many others.
Their legacy, it's still inspiring activists today. It's a reminder that even when things seem impossible, power can win.
It's powerful for sure. But, the story doesn't end with the abolition of slavery. The legacy of this system, it's complex, and it's still with us today in lots of ways.
Right. We can't just celebrate the victories without acknowledging the deep scars slavery left behind.
And that's what we'll dig into in the final part of our deep dive. We'll explore that ongoing fight for racial justice and unpack how the legacy of slavery is still shaping our world.
Back for the final part of our deep dive. It's been quite a journey. From ancient Greece to the Enlightenment, all those messed up justifications for slavery, and then that incredible rise of the abolition movement. Yeah.
And now I think we got to face something tough. The legacy of slavery, it's not just like history book stuff. It's still woven into our world today.
Yeah, it's like we've peeked behind the curtain.
Yeah.
And seen those mechanics behind so many of the inequalities that still exist.
Exactly. It's sobering, but it's also empowering in a way. It forces us to acknowledge those deep roots, of racism, prejudice, economic disparity, stuff that's still affecting us.
Okay, so let's break it down. What are some of the most obvious ways this legacy shows up in our world today?
Well, one of the big ones is, racial prejudice and discrimination. All those centuries of, dehumanizing rhetoric, policies designed to, subjugate people of African descent, those didn't just vanish when slavery ended.
Like those justifications we talked about, right? The whole natural inferiority thing. That didn't just go poof when they signed a law.
Nope. Those ideas, they morphed, adapted, they got embedded in our culture, our institutions, even our unconscious biases. It's tricky.
So we're talking like implicit bias in hiring, racial profiling by cops, the way poverty and mass incarceration disproportionately affect communities of color.
All that and more. It's a whole web of interconnected problems stemming from that historical dehumanization and marginalization of Black people. It's a lot.
Yeah. It can feel kind of overwhelming, honestly. Where do you even begin to, unravel something so deeply rooted?
Got to start by admitting there's a problem. Can't address what we don't see, right? So education is key. Learn about the history of slavery, its consequences, and then, got to look inward, too. Examine our own biases, even the ones we don't realize we have. That's tough, but important.
You're right. Not enough to just say, well, I'm not racist. We got to actively work to dismantle these systems, even if that means, confronting some uncomfortable truths.
Yeah.
About ourselves, about our society.
Exactly. It's about understanding these issues are systemic, not just about individual bad people. It's about how policies, institutions, cultural norms, all that stuff, it's designed to disadvantage certain groups based on race, ethnicity.
Okay, so beyond awareness, beyond looking in the mirror, what can we actually do about this legacy?
Lots of approaches, really. No magic bullet, gotta say that. But some key areas, we can promote racial justice, equity in education, healthcare, housing, jobs.
So level the playing field, basically. Make sure everyone has a shot no matter their race.
Right. Address those systemic barriers that prevent people of color from achieving what they're capable of. That includes criminal justice reform, too, right? Given how messed up mass incarceration is, how it targets Black communities.
100%. We got to address the systemic racism in the whole justice system. From policing to sentencing, it's all got to be looked at. It's a huge task, but essential if we want a truly just, equitable society.
Can feel daunting, but the good news is there are so many people, so many organizations working on this. Activists, educators, policymakers, artists, regular folks, all pushing for change.
So it's not like hopeless. There's reason to be optimistic if we all pitch in.
Exactly. We all have a role to play in dismantling these systems. Use our voices, our resources, or whatever we got to amplify those most affected by these injustices, support those organizations doing the work, and, well, hold our elected officials accountable, make them enact policies that actually promote equity, justice.
It's a marathon, not a sprint, huh? But together, we can move things forward.
Absolutely. The pursuit of justice, it never ends. It's constant work. But we can, draw inspiration from those who came before us, those who fought to end slavery. They paved the way.
This deep dive, man, it's been heavy but eye-opening for sure.
It's a journey through some dark stuff, no doubt. But also it shows how resilient humans are, how we can change things.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And with that, I think we got to leave our listeners with one final thought.
What are the systems, the structures in our time that future generations are going to look back on and be like, what the heck were they thinking? What truths do we cling to now that'll be seen as harmful, wrong later on?
Whoa, that's a heavy question. Makes you really think. It's like we always got to be questioning our own assumptions. Be open to the possibility that, that we might be wrong.
And with that, this deep dive into the justifications of slavery and its legacy, well, it's come to an end. Thanks for sticking with us.
And remember, the fight for justice, it's never over. Let's all do our part to make sure the horrors of slavery stay in the past, where they belong.